I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today we're looking at a text that's an oldie but a goodie.
Depending on who you ask, not a lot of people are going to pick this up on a long, cold winter night just to kill some time.
I know some friends of mine in China and Taiwan who would definitely do that.
Okay, those are very boring people then.
I'm a boring person. What are you trying to say?
I agree, but that explains a lot, actually.
So we're looking today at Mencius. Mencius is the Latinized name of what Chinese philosopher? Mengzi. So during the 16th and 17th century, lots of these Jesuits came to China to try and convert China to being Christian. They transmitted a lot of Chinese ideas, and one of the ways they did that was through these philosophers who they gave them Latinized names.
And Mencius would, of course, be the transliterated version of Mengzi. Mencius is classed, well, there's sort of four major philosophers, like the Chinese version of Plato and Aristotle, or if you like, Plato and Aristotle are the sort of European versions of these people. But the terms that they are given in Chinese are Kong Meng and Lao Zhuang, which is Kongzi, Mengzi, they're paired together, so Confucius and Mencius. And then you've got Laozi and Zhuangzi together. So roughly, and if they're ever going to listen to this, Michael Nyland and our professor Luke Haberstadt are going to cringe when I say this. You've got roughly the Confucians and the Taoists. Laozi and Zhuangzi are the Taoists, and Confucius and Mencius are the Confucians.
To be fair, that's how it's taught in a lot of Western kind of elementary or middle school textbooks. That's Confucianism versus Taoism versus Buddhism as the three main Chinese, I'm using scare quotes here, religions.
Right.
We don't really, at least in Confucius, he's actually not talking about Confucianism because he's not saying, I did something that was great. He's saying we should...
He's being quoted as saying things.
Yeah.
Or if in fact he said all of those things anyway. But
I think Mencius is interesting because you start to see the beginning of some sort of formation of a school that would eventually become this giant mass that is Confucianism.
If you haven't read any of this before, the good shorthand for this is that Confucius and Laozi are sort of the founders of their respective schools, but it was their respective followers, in this case Mencius and Zhuangzi, that expand and codify what they started. So these... If you've read much of the Bible, this would be their version of the Apostle Paul, who takes some of the basic teachings of Jesus and expands them into something much bigger.
Gives it a kind of theological basis.
Yes.
Although I hesitate to use the word theology because there's not much theo in Confucianism or in Confucius or Mencius.
Mencius in particular is very, very primarily concerned really with how to have a well-functioning society where the rulers and the people all benefit and prosper and everything is as it should be.
You mentioned before we did the podcast that Confucius and Mencius were very much in vogue in France.
Yes.
Voltaire loved the pair as a kind of...
sort of an anti-religion, even at that point...
Totally rationalist, right?
Totally rational. Voltaire himself adapted.
Yeah, it's fine. You can
adapted. Anyway,
Ezra Pound style translation.
There was a lot to be had in a vision of China where religion never existed. It's just pure rational. People are all thinking people. They want to simply form a society where everyone works well together, and they don't have to make any reference to religious figures or gods or demons or anything like that.
It kind of reminds me of the Hegelian notion that China is outside of history.
Yeah.
I mean, they're quite different. Whatever you don't like about your own country, you kind of find it in China, or whatever you love.
China does that thing that we should do but don't.
Yeah. Knowing nothing and having never been to China,
right? And arguably, it's not Confucius but Mencius that lends it this, because, as I say, he's sort of the one that expands and codifies this. A lot of the passages in the Mencius is him sort of interpreting or expanding upon an older philosopher, or talking with kings of various states. We're talking about roughly 4th century BC.
Yeah, I was going to ask, can we put a number on it?
So it's what, 327 BC?
Almost 372 to 289.
Okay, so
BC.
I was in the ballpark anyway.
Dyslexic.
I'm actually looking at the number you scrawled in your book, but it's from an angle, so I can't. It looks like 327.
So we're talking about the Warring States period here. That's the period in which the Zhou dynasty is kind of coming apart. The Zhou dynasty had existed as a sort of, again, I'm going to have to use scare quotes here because feudal means so many different things, but it existed as a kind of feudal dynasty where there was a centralized ruler, but power was dispersed throughout all of these communities. You eventually have states that are forming under the Zhou dynasty, and increasingly these states become more and more powerful and less beholden to the Zhou kings. I think of it as a period similar to 17th and 18th and 19th century Europe, in that you have all of these competing states. They're eventually going to compete, lots of them out of existence, to the point where you have about 7 to 10 major powers.
Go ahead. Sorry, I interrupted you.
And they're the thing that's driving Mencius is how to be a good king and how to figure out how to rule your people best so that you can expand your population and expand your state and eventually become the dude. I mean, that's not to be too philosophical.
And
look
there. For the thing that holds the room together. Let's go ahead and just get into this passage we've chosen. In some ways, talking about Mencius is a peculiar thing for any topical podcast because when you start asking questions like, well, is this literature? Is this philosophy? Well, kind of all of the above. He doesn't really read as philosophical, and I'm putting quotes around this as well, the way we would read Kant or Hegel or even Plato or Aristotle. This reads almost like a political self-help tract.
It's a dummy's guide to ruling ancient Chinese style.
And some of it just sounds very basic, but it would not have really scanned as basic when he was propounding it, right?
It is very basic in terms of the language. Actually, Mencius is one of the things that people who are studying classical Chinese read because it makes so much sense and it's so systematic. It's a very good kind of intro.
So the passage we're looking at is there's an entire section of the Mencius in which he is talking with a king, King Liang of Hui. It's just, depending on the translation you have, it's either a series of running dialogues, like a long section of them just talking, or in the Mencius, they're actually set off into sections, as though they sort of have these chats periodically over a series of days or weeks or months. And in this particular passage, this is in the third King Liang of Hui sort of dialogue in the book. He's basically the King Liang of Hui is complaining to Mencius that basically people aren't just flocking to his kingdom. And Mencius says, basically, something that sounds so basic that we would really credit it as any sort of political philosophy. I'm going to just read a short section so the listener gets an idea of what we're talking about. And Mencius says to the king, if the seasons of husbandry, that of course meaning, the keeping of animals and things like that, be not interfered with, the grain will be more than can be eaten. If close nets are not allowed to enter the pools and ponds, the fishes and turtles will be more than can be consumed. If the axes and bills enter the hills and forests only at the proper time, the wood will be more than can be used. When the grain and fish and turtles are more than can be eaten, and there is more wood than can be used, this enables the people to nourish their living and mourn for their dead without any feeling against any. This condition, in which the people nourish their living and bury their dead without any feeling against any, is the first step of royal government. Now, there's a phrase right in the middle there, and this is James Leggey's classic translation. The phrase is the proper time. And that phrase is crucial for understanding anything to do with Confucius and Mencius. The idea is for things to be ordered, for things to happen when they're supposed to happen. So when it's time to harvest, you harvest. You don't do anything to make the harvest go faster or slower. The people harvest when it's time to do that. They eat what they need. And that is all. Because the king's complaint, of course, is what can I do to make sure everybody wants to join my kingdom and leave all the other kingdoms? And Mencius' response is, well, you can't.
it seems almost like this kind of small government libertarian response, in that the best government is the government that governs least.
Yeah, it's and that's going to come up a lot in the Mencius.
Yeah.
But
I want to point something out that actually comes up in Sima Qian, in the chapter on what's essentially a kind of proto-capitalistic exposition in Sima Qian, the Huo Zhe Lie Zhuan, which is the I don't know how to translate it. The ones who move goods. He also uses that same kind of terminology where it's all about doing things at the right time, but in Mencius, at least, it's about the government doing things at the right time. Whereas with Sima Qian, he was emphasizing how these kind of proto-capitalist merchants are figuring things out, and how markets just kind of magically almost figure out the right time to do things.
And in this case, his advice to the king, it's interesting because Mencius never says to a king, just don't do anything. Like, let the people just do whatever they want. Things do need to be ordered by a sovereign, but they should be ordered in such a way that the people can take care of themselves.
What is the role of the sovereign in this passage, though?
In this passage, it's a little unclear, frankly. I think this is one of the ones where Mencius is basically telling the king of Liang, you need to stop thinking that if you just try hard enough, your kingdom will be amazing. Like, there's so many things in play here that you can't control, and you need to be wise and let things happen when they're supposed to happen. So this is an example of the king taking his hands off the wheel a little bit, not letting the kingdom take its course completely, but understanding that, so the phrase, if close nets are not allowed to enter the pools and ponds, the fishes and turtles will be more than can be consumed. The actual Chinese translation there is, it's nets with big holes versus nets with small holes. And the idea was, if you fished with a net that had little tiny holes, everything got caught indiscriminately. Like, if it was in the water, it got in your net. But if you used a net with big holes, then some of the larger fish got caught, but the smaller ones would escape and then grow into bigger fish later.
I want to look back at a slightly earlier passage in the same section where King Liang is talking about how hard he works to get the people of his country doing well. He says, when there's a famine on one side of the river, I move them to another place. When there's a famine in that place, I move them back. And he's saying, like, my effort is what why is my effort not actually like paying off? And the point that Mencius is making is that it doesn't matter how much you do or don't do. What's more important is that you do the right thing. And the role, I think, for the state here in Mencius is regulatory.
Yeah.
It's not about getting people to like where the food is. It's about maintaining the nets.
Well, and one of the implications here, because Mencius gives the king a lot of examples of basically poor husbandry of resources. One of the implications here is that the famine may not be natural. It could be human caused, right? I mean, it doesn't say that specifically, but the fact that all of his examples are, if you just let this thing happen, if you just make people fish in such a way that small fish will grow into big fish and everyone has enough to eat, indicates that the king's policies to date really haven't done a good job of that.
Can I ask you, this sounds surprisingly Taoist to me.
I was just thinking that, actually. It does sound Taoist, because that's one of the foundational ideas of Taoism, is that...
So you just kind of let go with the flow, I think, is the way it's often translated.
Right? It's the way. There's a way, the way that things happen. It is not your job to figure out how to make things work. They're already working. Your job is to figure out how to fit in with the stuff that's already working. And so there is kind of that note here with Mencius basically telling the king, look, small fish will eventually grow into big fish, right? So leave the small fish alone and only catch the big ones, because the only ones you can really eat are the big ones anyway.
What's surprising, though, is that at least in terms of later forms of Confucianism, Mencius and Confucius are often used to justify a big government,
Right.
kind of heavy-handed, very much controlling the people, like morally raising up the people and having a huge role in education and inculcating values. At least in this passage, and I'm not saying all of Mencius is like this, because it's not, but at least in this passage, that's very much not the Mencius we're getting.
But now, and to be fair, there are other places in the Mencius where he does hold up a sort of moral role, almost a moral regulatory role for the king. But here, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this little passage, is it is very peculiar.
It's strange.
If you're gonna hold up,
this is not your granddad's Mencius.
This is not your granddad's Confucian thought in general. But because well, I don't know what Voltaire would have made of it, and he's not my granddad. But the
big
idea
reveal
applies.
on this podcast.
I'm older than I sound. I know, right? But it is interesting because
Rob's grandfather is actually Methuselah.
Yeah, that's it. But what's interesting here is, like you were saying, how atypical this sounds for the sort of the patron saint of
heavy-handed Chinese government.
Sort of advice is saying to the government, you know what you need to do? Just basically shut up and let the people do what they already know how to do.
Chiang Kai-shek used Confucius and Mencius a lot. Chiang Kai-shek being the dictator of China from sort of 1925 on and off till 1949 when he lost to Mao Zedong, and then he became the dictator of Taiwan only until he died in 1976. And to date, this podcast, just last week, the Taiwanese government decided to reconsider his place in Taiwan's history. They passed a law.
What does this have to do with Confucius and Mencius Lee?
Chiang Kai-shek used Confucius and Mencius quite a bit in his justification of his heavy-handed dictatorial rule.
And if he'd read this passage, if he'd had this podcast at his disposal, how different would history have been, Lee?
To be fair, I'm not entirely sure he was a huge reader. He wasn't really a scholar.
But he wouldn't have had to read. He could have just listened to us, Lee. You know? If only we'd been around.
That actually should be the emblem of the podcast, just Chiang Kai-shek with earbuds listening to us.
Or just a big Chiang Kai-shek with a face palm. Just like, oh, why didn't I think of this before? Oh.
So, Rob, I've got to ask you, if this is not your granddad's Mencius, why are we introducing the listener to Mencius using this passage?
And that's a good question, actually, because I think there are more canonical passages. There are one or two I would like to talk about at some point. But it's a fun one to bring in precisely for the reason that it complicates things a little bit. When I think of literature, I always think of something that's very hard to nail down. The moment you can effectively say, this person thinks this thing, and it's always that thing, it stops being very interesting. And if you read the Mencius as a literary work, it's very interesting because you're allowed to have sort of a passage that doesn't seem to fit because Mencius was a person talking to people. So clearly it's not always going to be this perfectly methodic, systematic approach.
We've talked about this before in earlier podcasts on the Zhuangzi and the Confucian, the Analects. There's not really a divide in early Chinese thought between philosophy and literature. These kinds of genres are later adaptations. I think that's definitely true here. One interesting thing, so I was being tutored by a philosopher in Qingdao, and he claimed that Chinese did not have any philosophy. Like, there was no philosophy in China. And he's Chinese, and I asked him what he was saying, and he said, well, philosophy requires logic, and Chinese people don't have logic. Now, I completely disagree with this philosopher's perspective, but I think you can sort of start to see some of that in the way Mencius and Confucius and Zhuangzi kind of lay out their arguments. What's happening here in Mencius is almost entirely rhetorical.
Yes.
Now, Greek philosophers would have been rhetorical as well. In fact, you have the Sophists, but there is a strain of logic in Greek philosophy that continues on to a certain degree in Western philosophy that Chinese philosophers like Mencius, they just don't seem that concerned with that sort of thing. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but I'm just saying that's an important difference to recognize. And when we see this passage, I think we can see it coming out in this passage.
Yeah, and I would add just to the end of that that it's not philosophical in the sense that it doesn't. You know, when you read Immanuel Kant, for example, Kant.
Oh, goodness gracious!
I know, right? That's difficult on a whole new level. But Kant's whole critical project starts with his desire to have essentially a methodical approach to a series of questions, right? Mencius is not coming up with some method that you apply to all situations. He's dealing with the situations as they come. That's sort of the pretext or the pretense even for this work, is he's talking to the King Liang of Hui, right? And the king has this problem. The king has this question. Mencius answers the question with his own thoughts, and they move on. It's dialogic, right? And so it does read, frankly, more like literature. And yet, unlike literature, there's no real character development necessarily. There's none of the really conventions we think of. So it's a very curious work in a lot of ways.
We talked about Zhuangzi some.
Yeah.
Zhuangzi is similar in some ways, but he has real character development, and he's actually quite funny. His characters are hilarious. I think one of the things that's missing from Mencius that I love in the Zhuangzi is that sense of humor.
Yeah, I would have to agree.
And although I recommend reading Mencius for someone who's learning classical Chinese, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to read him all that much.
Yeah, it's very hard. He's heavy weighting if you go into this from the historical perspective, like you want to know where certain political ideas in China come from. Invaluable.
Absolutely.
Invaluable. If you're reading it as a work of literature with a capital L, sort of as beautiful writing or thought, I don't know. It's not. I don't go back to the Mencius for that.
Can I ask you, Rob,
Please.
before we close out, do you see any contemporaneous echoes of this going on in discussions today in the PRC?
Well, I don't know. Not really. I think today's PRC leans a lot more towards the heavy-handed idea of government rather than let the people, because, you have, instead of marshaling natural resources in a responsible way in their time, you have, the opposite of that in most places.
What's interesting is that increasingly the Communist Party draws its legitimacy off of its claim to represent Chinese and Chineseness, and that draws heavily off of this kind of pushing of Confucius and to a lesser degree Mencius. But I think one of the things that we've demonstrated here is it's not that black and white.
It's not at all.
Confucianism, Mencius, they're not. I mean, there is a strain in there that is kind of libertarian.
Yeah, it is.
That seems more like a kind of Silicon Valley style of governing rather than a Zhongnanhai style.
Right. Zhongnanhai.
Silicon Valley versus Zhongnanhai. I think we should leave it at that.
I think we should.
All right. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.